The Blackstone Manor gleamed under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers as the last of the evening guests departed into the cool night air. Nina Harper moved through the dining room with practiced grace, collecting the final wine glasses and clearing forgotten napkins. Her feet ached after standing for 12 hours straight, but she kept her posture perfect, her smile warm, even as exhaustion weighed on her shoulders. She had learned long ago that invisibility was survival in a place like this. You kept your head down, did your job, and never let anyone see the cracks forming beneath your professional exterior. The kitchen was her sanctuary now, quieter than the frenetic energy of service hours. The stainless steel counters reflected the overhead lights, and the only sound was the occasional clink of plates being stacked by Marcus, the line cook who was finishing his own cleanup. Nina made her way to the small locker room tucked away in the back, where she hung her jacket, her apron, her carefully constructed facade for the evening. She sat heavily on the bench, feeling the weight of the day settle into her bones. Her shift had ended, but she lingered for a moment, needing just a few minutes to herself before heading back to her small apartment, where her daughter Emma would be sleeping peacefully under the watch of her mother, Mrs. Chen, who had babysat again tonight. The money from this job barely covered childcare, rent, and groceries, but it was honest work, and the tips were decent at a place as exclusive as Blackstone Manor. She thought of Emma often during these quiet moments, remembering why she pushed through each grueling day. Without thinking about it, Nina reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a worn photograph of her 5-year-old daughter. Emma stood in front of their apartment building, wearing a bright yellow sundress, her gap-toothed smile impossibly wide. She had taken that photo just 3 weeks ago, and already Emma was changing, growing, becoming someone new each day that Nina sometimes felt she was missing. She traced her daughter's face with her thumb, her chest tightening with a familiar ache. What would Emma become, she wondered? Could Nina give her the life she deserved? Would there be money for dance lessons, piano lessons, college someday? Or would Emma grow up like Nina had, in poverty, always wanting, always reaching for things just beyond her grasp? These questions haunted her during moments like this, when the professional mask slipped and the raw truth of her circumstances crashed over her like waves. She allowed herself to feel it then, the weight of responsibility, the fear, the desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, things would get better. That was when she heard it, the soft sound of footsteps on the kitchen tile. It made her jolt, and quickly she tucked the photograph back into her pocket. Her heart raced and she straightened her shoulders, remembering where she was. Mr. Blackstone never came back to the kitchen during service hours, but sometimes she heard he made surprise visits at odd times to check on operations. She smoothed her hair and composed her expression into something neutral and professional. But when she stepped back into the kitchen, no one was there. The space was empty, save for Marcus, who had his back turned, loading the final trays into the dishwasher. Nina glanced around, confused, but Marcus simply waved at her without turning fully around. She must have imagined it. Perhaps her exhaustion was playing tricks on her mind, making her hear things that weren't there. She exhaled slowly and tried to calm the sudden spike of adrenaline that had flooded her system. Unknown to Nina, a figure remained in the shadows near the kitchen entrance, partially hidden by the open door to the wine storage room. Ethan Blackstone stood motionless as she returned to her tasks. His dark eyes followed her movements, and his expression was unreadable, a mixture of fascination and something deeper, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years.
The morning after the kitchen encounter, Ethan sat in his executive office on the 42nd floor of the Blackstone Tower, overlooking the city, his hands folded on the mahogany desk before him. The view was breathtaking, but he saw none of it. His mind kept replaying the image of Nina, holding that photograph, the way her fingers had traced the face of the child, the raw emotion that had crossed her features when she thought no one was watching. He had built an empire through ruthlessness and calculated decisions, leaving little room for sentiment or distraction. Yet here he was, unable to focus on the contracts, spreadsheets, and merger proposals that usually commanded his complete attention, all because of a waitress. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. Perhaps it was the contrast she represented against the artificial world he inhabited, where everyone wanted something from him, where authenticity was extinct. By that afternoon, Ethan had made a decision. He instructed his head manager, James, to pull the employment file for Nina Harper. He wanted to know everything about her, though he wasn't entirely sure why. It felt intrusive, but he rationalized it as knowing his staff, which was technically true. James returned within the hour with a thin folder containing her application, references, and background check information. Ethan read through it methodically. Her full name was Nina Elizabeth Harper, age 28, single mother, works 3 jobs, including the restaurant to support her daughter. She had moved to the city 5 years ago from a small town in Nebraska and had no family connections in the area. No wealthy relatives, no safety net. Nothing but determination and the will to survive. He found himself moved by the story told through these sparse official documents. That evening, as he reviewed the Blackstone Manor operations, Ethan made another decision. He would attend the dinner service himself, something he rarely did anymore. He told himself it was routine management, but the truth was more complicated. The truth was that he needed to see her again, needed to understand this unexpected pull toward a woman so different from anyone in his social circle. When Nina arrived for her evening shift, she had no way of knowing that her night would be anything but ordinary. She clocked in, changed into her uniform, and headed to the dining room to begin her tables. The restaurant was already filling up with the wealthy elite of the city. Business people, socialites, investors, all seeking the culinary perfection and exclusivity that Blackstone Manor offered. As she moved through the dining room with practiced efficiency, taking orders, delivering courses, clearing plates, she became aware of a presence, a weight of attention that felt different from the usual scrutiny of demanding guests. Finally, she glanced toward the bar, and her breath caught. Her eyes met Ethan's across the crowded restaurant, and for a moment time seemed to stop. His gaze held hers, and she saw something in it, something that made her pulse quicken. Then he looked away first, and she was left standing with her empty tray and a racing heart, wondering if what she had just experienced was real or imagined. Throughout the evening, she felt him watching her when he thought she wasn't aware. The intensity of his attention both thrilled and terrified her. She had always made it a point to be invisible to the owner, the man whose name was spoken with reverence throughout the restaurant, the man who was so far above her station that acknowledging her existence felt like crossing an impossible boundary. Yet tonight, his eyes kept finding her, and each time they did, she felt a spark of something dangerous building inside her. As the service drew to a close, a manager approached Nina with an unusual request. Mr. Blackstone would like you to deliver a special dessert personally to his table in the private dining room. Her hands trembled slightly as she prepared the plate, a delicate chocolate creation with edible gold leaf. She made her way through the corridors of the restaurant, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. When she entered the private dining room, Ethan was alone. He had sent his guests away specifically for this moment. She stood in the doorway, uncertain whether to enter fully, and he gestured for her to come closer. As she set the plate before him, their hands nearly brushed across the table, and the electricity between them was undeniable. He thanked her, and his voice was softer than she had ever heard it, less like the commanding billionaire, and more like a man with vulnerabilities of his own. In that brief moment before she turned to leave, he said her name, Nina. The way he said it held such weight, such intention, that she felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. She looked back at him and saw something raw in his expression, something that mirrored the vulnerability she had revealed in the kitchen when she thought no one was watching.
3 days had passed since that charged moment in the private dining room, and Nina found herself constantly replaying it, each time discovering new details, new possible meanings in the way he had looked at her. Each night she returned to the restaurant wondering if he would be there, and each night her heart would race when she saw him, though he maintained professional distance during service, treating her no differently than any other staff member in public. But the gestures had begun, small ones at first. A single white rose left on her locker with no note, an extra break authorized by a manager who claimed it came from executive request. her favorite coffee order prepared perfectly waiting for her before she even arrived, a classical music playlist created and somehow playing in the employee break room with songs she could never have explained how he knew she loved. Emma asked her about the gifts when she came home. Why did Mommy have a fancy rose in a vase? Nina had struggled to answer truthfully, so instead she told her daughter that sometimes the universe brought good things when you worked hard, when you believed things could be better. Emma had accepted this with the pure logic of childhood and continued coloring her pictures. But Nina knew better. She knew this was something else, something intentional, something that violated every professional boundary, something that simultaneously thrilled and terrified her, because it came from a man who could destroy her livelihood with a single word, a man whose world was so fundamentally different from hers that any connection between them felt impossible, no matter how real the spark between them seemed to burn. On the 8th day after the private dining room encounter, Ethan arranged for the restaurant to close for private cleaning during the lunch hour. He had never done such a thing before, and the staff was confused, but compliant. When Nina arrived for her shift, expecting an ordinary evening, she was informed she was needed early to assist with inventory in the kitchen. The restaurant was nearly empty, save for a few maintenance workers, and when she made her way downstairs, she found Ethan waiting in the kitchen, alone. She froze. Her professional mask nearly slipped completely as he turned to face her. His hair was slightly disheveled, his jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled up as if he had been working. He looked younger somehow, more human than the controlled, powerful figure she usually observed from a distance. He asked if she would share a meal with him. A simple dinner, he said, just the two of them in the kitchen where it had all begun, where he had seen her true self, where something had shifted between them. She wanted to say no. She should have said no. Every logical part of her mind screamed that this was dangerous, foolish, that she was crossing a line from which there could be no return. But when she looked at him, she saw not the billionaire owner but a man who seemed as vulnerable as she felt, as uncertain about what was happening between them. They cooked together, moving around each other in the spacious kitchen with a natural rhythm that surprised them both. He prepared a pasta dish, his hands moving with confidence suggesting culinary training. She made a salad, adding herbs and dressing with the precision of someone who had spent years in kitchens learning from observation. He told her about his childhood, about a mother who had loved to cook, about the reason he had purchased this restaurant, about the loneliness that came with having everything, except someone to share it with. She listened, and when he asked about her life, she found herself opening up in ways she never had before. She told him about Emma, about her dreams, about the impossible weight of responsibility. She told him things she had never admitted to anyone, her fears that she wasn't enough, her constant worry that her daughter deserved better than what she could provide, her secret moments of despair late at night when the bills piled up and the future seemed impossibly dark. As they sat at a small table in the kitchen, eating the meal they had prepared together, the space between them seemed to diminish. Without conscious decision, their hands found each other across the table. His touch sent electricity through her nervous system, and she felt tears forming in her eyes not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sensation of being truly seen by another person for the first time in years. He reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek, and the tenderness of the gesture broke something open inside her. She knew this was complicated. She knew the power imbalance made it precarious. She knew the world would judge them harshly, but in that moment in the kitchen where it had all begun, she allowed herself to believe that maybe something real could grow between them, something worth the risk, something worth fighting for.
2 weeks had passed since the private dinner, and Nina was drowning in a sea of conflicting emotions. Everything had changed, yet nothing had changed on the surface. She and Ethan had stolen moments together, brief encounters carefully orchestrated to avoid suspicion. A text message here, a call there, stolen glances across the restaurant that burned with intensity. They had kissed only once in the private confines of his penthouse apartment high above the city where no one could see them, where the world felt distant and unimportant. But that single kiss had rewritten everything she thought she knew about passion, about connection, about the possibility of love crossing impossible boundaries. The problem was that reality had a way of crashing through even the most beautiful moments. Mrs. Chen had noticed something was different about Nina. She was distracted during pickups with Emma, asking to stay late at work when normally she rushed home. Her mind was elsewhere,
constantly cycling between the impossible hope that this could work and the crushing fear that it would all come crashing down around her. At work, the other staff members had begun whispering. Nina could feel it in the way conversations stopped when she approached, in the curious looks, the knowing smiles. She had tried to be careful, tried to maintain professional distance during service, but Ethan had made it increasingly difficult. He would find excuses to speak with her, his eyes would linger on her a moment too long, his hand would brush hers when passing documents, and each touch was a reminder of what they were doing in secret. The real crisis came on a Wednesday evening when James, the head manager, pulled her aside with concern etched across his face. He told her that one of the regular guests, a wealthy socialite named Victoria Hartley, had noticed the dynamic between her and Mr. Blackstone. Victoria had mentioned it casually to several other patrons, and now whispers were beginning to spread through the elite circles that frequented the restaurant. James didn't accuse her of anything, but the implication was clear. If this became public knowledge, the scandal could destroy her job, her reputation, everything. That night, after her shift, Nina found herself sitting alone in her apartment, staring at her phone. She wanted to call Ethan to warn him, but she was terrified. He lived in a world where scandal could be managed, where lawyers and publicists existed to contain damage, but she was not protected by such things. One viral story, one photograph, one accusation, and she would lose everything. When her phone rang and his name appeared on the screen, her heart nearly stopped. She answered to hear his voice tight with something that sounded like anger or fear or both. He had heard the gossip too. People were talking, asking questions. Victoria Hartley had apparently confronted him at his office building, asking if the rumors were true, if he was really involved with one of his waitresses. The tone of her question had made clear what she really meant. A man of his stature did not become involved with someone like Nina, someone beneath him, someone disposable. Ethan told her that they needed to be more careful, that he was working on a solution, but in the background of the call, Nina could hear the weight of the world pressing down on him. She realized then that she had been naive to believe this could work, that love alone could overcome the massive gulf between their worlds. He was facing pressure from his board, from his social circles, from every direction to end this. Whatever was happening between them was becoming a liability, and she could already sense him beginning to pull away. She wanted to scream at him, wanted to demand that he fight for what they had. But she also understood his position, understood that his entire empire was built on maintaining a certain image, a certain standard. She was the risk, the complication, the problem that needed to be solved. And suddenly, she felt very small, very expendable, very much like she had made a terrible mistake by allowing her heart to hope for something that was never meant to be hers.
1 month later, Nina stood in the Blackstone Manor kitchen during the lunch preparation, her movements mechanical and efficient. She had requested a transfer to the day shift, citing the need to have more time with Emma. The truth was far more complex. She could no longer bear the torture of working in the evenings when Ethan was present, when she could see him from a distance, when their eyes might accidentally meet and reignite the fire that was slowly consuming her. The weeks following that phone call had been a study in heartbreak. Ethan had maintained distance, had been cordial but distant during the rare moments their professional paths crossed. He had not called, had not texted, had not sought her out. Everything they had built in the shadows had crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny and the demands of his world. She had known it would end this way, had prepared herself for it, yet the pain of it was somehow worse than any heartbreak she had experienced before. Emma had asked about the roses. The flowers had stopped coming 3 weeks ago, and her daughter had noticed their absence with the unfiltered observation of a child. Nina had simply told her that sometimes beautiful things didn't last, that the world didn't always cooperate with the things we wanted most. She hoped that at 5 years old, Emma was too young to understand that her mother had just described her own broken heart. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, everything shifted. A delivery arrived at the restaurant, addressed to Nina. A box wrapped in elegant paper with a handwritten note attached. She stared at it for several minutes, afraid of what opening it might mean, afraid that it would either be the beginning of something or the final goodbye. Inside, she found a leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with handwriting, beautiful and deliberate, page after page of Ethan's thoughts about her, about their time together, about the impossible situation they found themselves in. He had written about watching her in the kitchen, about the moment he first heard her laugh, about the fear that had driven him to pull away, not because he didn't want her, but because he was terrified of what wanting her meant.
He wrote about the loneliness of his empire, about how she had taught him that money and power meant nothing if you had no one to share your life with. The final pages were different. They contained a proposal, not romantic in the traditional sense, but radical in its honesty. He wanted to step back from some of his business responsibilities, wanted to sell the Blackstone Manor, wanted to build a life with her and Emma that wasn't defined by his wealth or her servitude. He wrote that he had spent years building an empire and had only just realized he had built it because he was searching for something money could never buy, a reason to matter to someone, a reason to be loved. He asked her to meet him at the restaurant at midnight, when it was closed and empty, when they could be alone without the world watching, without the weight of their circumstances pressing down on them. He asked her to bring Emma. He wanted to meet their daughter formally, wanted to know the child that Nina loved so fiercely, wanted to understand the full extent of what she was asking him to accept. Nina read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking. She thought of Emma, of the life they had built, of the small dreams she harbored. She thought of Ethan, of the man she had glimpsed beneath the billionaire armor, of the vulnerability he had shared, of the way he had looked at her as if she was worth everything he had built and more. At midnight, she found herself standing at the door to Blackstone Manor, a sleeping Emma in her arms. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The kitchen was lit softly and candles flickered along the counter, illuminating the space where it had all begun. Ethan stood waiting, and when he saw her, when he saw his daughter for the first time, his expression crumpled with emotion. He moved towards them slowly, as if approaching something precious and fragile. When he gently touched Emma's sleeping face and turned to look at Nina with eyes full of tears and hope and desperate love, she realized that sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was choose to be vulnerable, choose to risk everything for a connection that transcended logic and reason, choose love even when the world said it was impossible. As Ethan drew them both close, the waitress and the billionaire who had been separated by circumstance and status and fear finally found their way home to each other in a kitchen that had witnessed their story from its very first secret moment.